She thought he was just another guy with car trouble, until the entire country saw his face on the news. Who was he really? And why did he lie to the only woman who saw him for who he was, before the headlines? The late afternoon sun dipped, low across the open countryside, casting long golden beams over fields of tall grass and quiet pastures. The two-lane road stretched endlessly ahead, winding through farmland and clusters of trees like a forgotten path to nowhere. There were no billboards, no traffic lights, no signs of modern life, only the hum of cicadas, the rustling of leaves in the warm breeze, and the fading echo of tires crunching gravel. Ethan Cole pulled his sleek black car to the shoulder, cursing, under his breath as the vehicle wobbled unevenly and finally came to a stop. He stepped out cautiously, his polished loafers sinking slightly into the dirt, and crouched beside the rear tire. Flat. Completely destroyed. A piece of sharp metal stuck out like a cruel joke mocking him. Perfect. He straightened with a sigh, brushing off his slacks and looking around. Nothing but fields. Not even a power line in sight. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his phone, only to be greeted with the dreaded message. No signal. He stared at the screen, then at the vast emptiness around him. The irony wasn't lost on him. One of the wealthiest tech entrepreneurs in the country, completely powerless in a place where his world meant nothing. Frustrated, Ethan tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and leaned against the car. He wasn't supposed to be here. He'd taken a detour, trying to escape the noise of the city, the demands of his board, and the endless expectations that came with being Ethan Cole, CEO of Calum Dynamics. The headlines had called him a visionary, a genius, a game changer. But lately, he just felt like a fraud, like a man playing a role so convincingly he'd forgotten who he was before the curtain rose. As he stared down the empty road, a sound broke the silence, the steady approach of an engine. He turned to see an old pickup truck rumbling toward him. Its red paint faded and chipped, the passenger mirror held on with duct tape. The truck slowed and pulled onto the shoulder. The driver's window rolled down, and a woman leaned out, her hair tucked into a messy ponytail beneath a worn baseball cap. "You need a hand?" she called out, her voice casual but steady, like someone used to taking charge. Ethan hesitated, caught off guard by her confidence. "Flat tire, and my jack's not working." She studied him for a moment, then pulled the truck into park and climbed out. She wore jeans with grease stains, a dark tank top tied at the waist, and boots that had clearly seen years of hard work. She looked young, maybe early 30s, but her presence carried weight, unshakable, self-assured. "Let me take a look," she said, grabbing a toolbox from the bed of her truck before he could answer. He blinked. "Are you a mechanic?" "Something like that," she replied, crouching beside the tire. "Name's Avery. My uncle owns the garage in town. I've been fixing engines since I was 12. She moved with fluid precision, inspecting the damage, her fingers sure and practiced. Ethan stood awkwardly beside her, unsure whether to help or stay out of her way. She didn't ask for assistance. She didn't make small talk. Within minutes, she had the car jacked up and the spare ready. "You hit something nasty," she said, tossing the ruined tire into the trunk. "This one's toast. Lucky your spare's in decent shape." Ethan watched her in disbelief. "You're really good at this." Avery stood and wiped her hands on a rag she pulled from her back pocket. "Thanks for the vote of confidence," she said with a grin. "You looked like you were about to call roadside assistance, but I figured I'd beat them to it." "I couldn't even get a signal," he admitted. "Figures. You're in the middle of nowhere, city boy." He smiled despite himself. "Is it that obvious?" "Only a little," she teased, slinging the toolbox back into her truck. "You clean up nice, but you don't know a damn thing about cars, do you?" "Not even remotely," he said, chuckling. A silence settled between them. Not awkward, but strangely grounding. He looked at her again, noticing the smudges of grease on her jawline, the faint scar above her eyebrow, the dirt under her fingernails. There was nothing polished about her, and yet she radiated something magnetic, unapologetically real. He reached for his wallet. "Let me pay you for your time." Avery shook her head. "I didn't stop to make a buck, just helping someone out." "Most people wouldn't." "Well, most people aren't from around here," she said, climbing into her truck. "But if you're feeling grateful, there's a diner a few miles up. Best burgers in the county. You can buy me dinner." He blinked. "Wait, are you serious?" She grinned. "Why not?" "Unless you got somewhere better to be." Before he could answer, the engine rumbled back to life and she pulled away, leaving a cloud of dust in her wake. Ethan stood in place, staring after her. It had been a long time since someone had surprised him like that. Since someone had done something for him without expecting anything in return. He wasn't used to kindness without agenda. He wasn't used to women who didn't care about his last name or what he owned. Back in the car, he sat behind the wheel, for a moment, fingers tapping the steering wheel. Then he pulled out onto the road, headed in the direction she had gone. The sun dipped lower, bathing the road in amber light. For the first time in weeks, he felt something shift. Not relief, not certainty, but a flicker of something deeper. Curiosity, hope, maybe even a strange kind of peace. He didn't know who Avery really was. He didn't know what kind of life she lived or what story lay behind her guarded smile. But he wanted to know, and, for a man who had spent the last decade chasing deals, headlines, and applause, that feeling was rare and worth following, even if it had started with nothing more than a flat tire and a girl with a wrench. The bell above the door gave a faint jingle as Ethan stepped into the diner. It smelled like grilled onions, coffee, grounds, and something sweet baking in the back, homey in a way that reminded him of childhood before ambition had taken over. Sunlight spilled through the dusty windows, casting soft shadows over faded booths and laminated menus. There, sitting alone at the counter with a mug of coffee and a dog-eared copy of Motor Trend magazine, was Avery. Her cap was off, and her hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, streaked with sun and probably a little engine oil. She looked up as he approached, not surprised but curious. "You found the place," she said, a hint of amusement in her tone. Ethan offered a cautious smile and slid onto the stool beside her. "Turns out there aren't many options between. Your garage and here. Convenient for you." "Convenient for me," he agreed. A waitress came over, her eyes flicking between the two of them with a subtle smile, as if already making assumptions. They ordered burgers and milkshakes, classic, no frills, and as they waited, Ethan found himself watching Avery more than he meant to. She looked different under fluorescent diner lights than she had under the fading sunset by the road. Softer, maybe, but not less strong. "You always fix strangers' cars on the side of the road?" he asked. "Only the ones who look like they haven't changed a tire in their life," he chuckled. "Guilty." She sipped her coffee and tilted her head slightly. "So what's your deal, really? You passing through or running away from something?" That caught him off guard. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "Does it have to be either?" "No," she said. "But usually it is." He stared at his hands, clean but calloused from years of gripping steering wheels and signing contracts, not tools. "Maybe I'm just trying to catch my breath." Avery didn't press. Instead, she turned the conversation to lighter things. Small-town quirks, local characters, the high school football team that hadn't won a game in 5 years but still had the biggest bonfire in the county every fall. Ethan listened, grateful for the shift. Her voice had a rhythm to it, unhurried and honest. She didn't fill silences, just to avoid them, and that was oddly comforting. When their food arrived, they ate slowly, the kind of meal that wasn't about sustenance but presence. He told her small, safe truths about himself. He worked in tech, managed a company, traveled a lot. She didn't ask what kind of company. Maybe she didn't care, or maybe she sensed he wasn't ready to tell her more. Instead, she spoke about her father. How he'd taught her to rebuild carburetors when she was barely tall enough to reach the workbench. How he believed in fixing what was broken, even when it was easier to start over. How he'd passed 2 years ago, leaving the garage, behind like a sacred trust. Ethan watched her eyes as she spoke, not the sadness in them, but the pride, the resilience. He envied it. He'd built an empire but had no idea what it meant to belong to something that deeply. "Sometimes I think about leaving," she admitted, swirling her milkshake with a spoon. "Traveling, seeing the world. Paris, Tokyo, all the places I only read about. But then I look at the garage, the people who rely on it, and I stay." He didn't respond right away. There was a vulnerability in her confession that deserved more than a throwaway comment. So instead he asked softly, "Do you ever resent it?" "Not really," she said. "It's not a cage, it's just not the right time to leave." The sky outside was beginning to darken, the sun casting dusky purples and golds over the diner's sign. They sat in that fading light, finishing their food in a silence that felt warm, not awkward. Eventually, Avery slid off the stool and grabbed her keys. I should head out, she said, her tone light but reluctant. Ethan stood too. Can I walk you to your truck? She gave him a look. That was half smile, half challenge. You don't strike me as the walker girl to her car type. I'm full of surprises. She didn't stop him. Outside, the air had cooled and crickets had begun their evening chorus. Her truck waited under the flickering light of a lamppost, still covered in dust from the back roads. As they stood by the driver's side, she leaned, casually against the door. You know you're not what I expected. Neither are you, he replied. Most guys I meet think I'm too rough around the edges. Maybe most guys don't know how to appreciate real edges. That made her laugh, a quiet surprise kind of laugh. She looked up at him then, studying his face like she was trying to decode it. Are you always this charming, or am I just catching you on a good day? She asked. He shrugged. I haven't had a good day in a while. Until today. Avery looked away, clearly unsure how to respond to that level of sincerity. But she didn't push him away. Thanks for dinner, she said, pulling the door open. Thanks for saving my life. Or at least my car. She climbed into the truck and closed the door, rolling down the window before starting the engine. You gonna be around long? I might be, he said. If there's a reason to stay. She gave him one last look, eyes unreadable in the dim light. Take care, city boy. And then she was gone. Her tail lights disappearing into the darkness, leaving behind the scent of gasoline and dust and something else Ethan couldn't quite name. Back at the motel, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, the room dimly lit by the glow of his laptop screen. Dozens of emails waited, all urgent, all from people needing something from him. His assistant had left 3 voicemails. His investors were asking for updates. But all Ethan could think about was the way Avery's eyes flickered when she talked about the garage, the strength in her voice, the way she hadn't asked him for anything, hadn't cared about his car, his money, or his identity. And that terrified him. Because the more he thought about it, the more he realized how rare that was, how rare she was. He'd built his life on precision, control, and image. But with her, he was just a man stranded on the side of the road. A man without a title or status or strategy. And for the first time in years, he'd felt seen. He didn't know what it meant yet. Didn't know where it would lead. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let that night be the last page of their story. Not when it finally felt like something real had begun. The sound of the radio was low, barely more than a murmur beneath the clang of metal and the rhythmic hiss of an air compressor. At Colin's garage, the hum of activity was constant, familiar. It was the kind of place where silence was rare, filled instead with the comforting soundtrack of labor. Tools being used, engines turning over, the occasional burst of laughter between mechanics. But this morning, the voice coming through the radio didn't belong to a weather report or local news bulletin. It was national, polished, and unmistakably serious. In other news, the anchor's voice said crisp and certain. Calem Dynamics CEO Ethan Cole has been notably absent from the public eye since finalizing one of the largest acquisitions in the company's history. Sources close to the executive say he's taken an unannounced leave of absence. Speculation swirls about where he might be. Avery froze, one hand resting against the edge of the engine bay. Her glove was streaked with oil, the rag in her other, hand halfway to wiping it off. The moment hung suspended in the air. And then, as if the world knew it had more to reveal, the anchor continued. Cole, often regarded as one of the tech industry's most elusive innovators, was last spotted in a rural area near the Appalachian region. One blurry photo posted on social media appears to show him standing next to a black luxury sedan with a flat tire. Could he be seeking refuge from the corporate spotlight, or is this simply another one of his infamous disappearing acts? Avery didn't hear the rest. She didn't need to. Because in that blurry photo on her phone, circulating now on half a dozen gossip sites, was a man leaning against a familiar car. The same car she'd knelt beside on a dusty roadside. The same man she'd shared burgers with at the diner, and stories with in the quiet hum of night. Ethan. Her breath left her in a slow, disbelieving exhale. For a long time, she didn't move. The air in the garage had thickened, pressing around her like invisible hands. In the background, her Uncle Mike was saying something, asking about a socket wrench or a parts order, but the words didn't register, because nothing about her reality felt solid anymore. He'd lied, not just about his name, but about everything. And the worst part wasn't the lie itself. It was that she had let him in, bit by bit, in ways she never allowed strangers to. She'd laughed with him, opened up about her father, shared pieces of herself that had remained locked away since the day her dad's heart gave out in the back office of the shop. She felt stripped bare. The drive to the motel was a blur. She didn't remember getting into her truck or how many red lights she may have run. All she knew was the thunder of betrayal building in her chest and the unbearable silence that came with realizing you'd been nothing more than a pit stop in someone else's carefully curated narrative. She knocked once, firm, controlled, and then again, harder. The door opened slowly, and there he was, wearing a t-shirt and jeans, hair still damp from a shower, the edges of exhaustion softening. His face, "Avery," he said, like a prayer. Ethan Cole," she interrupted, voice low and sharp. "CEO, visionary, liar." He blinked, pain flickering in his eyes. "Please let me explain." "Explain what?" she said, stepping past him into the room. "That you let me believe you were just some guy on the road. That you watched me open up, tell you things I haven't told anyone in years, and said nothing." He didn't deny it. That hurt more than anything. "I didn't want to lie," he said finally. "But I didn't know how to tell you without changing everything. I liked who I was around you. I liked being seen as someone normal. Not a headline, not a dollar sign." She crossed her arms, heart pounding. "So this was a test? You were trying to see if the small-town girl would like you without the money, the name?" "No," he said quickly. "It wasn't like that. I didn't plan any of this. I didn't expect to meet you. I didn't expect to care." His voice cracked on that last word, and for a moment he didn't look like a CEO at all. He looked like a man afraid of losing something real. But Avery couldn't see the sincerity through the fog of disappointment. "You should have told me the truth," she whispered. "You should have trusted me with it." "I was afraid," he said, quieter now. "Afraid that if I told you, you'd pull away. That you'd stop seeing me and only see the company, the articles, the money." She shook her head, voice trembling. "You never gave me the chance to prove I wouldn't." A heavy silence filled the space between them, stretching like a canyon. Finally, she stepped back, her hand tightening around her truck keys. "I can't do this, Ethan. I can't be with someone who doesn't trust me from the start." He stepped forward, but she raised her hand to stop him. "Don't. Please. Just don't." She left without another word. Back in her truck, she sat with her forehead against the steering wheel, breath shallow. She hated crying, hated how vulnerable it made her feel. But the tears came anyway, quiet and angry and full of everything she hadn't said. She hadn't let herself believe in something in a long time, and she had believed in him. Meanwhile, Ethan sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring at the door she had just walked through. He felt hollow, like something vital had been stripped away. In all the years of building his empire, he had never felt lost quite like this, because no amount of success had prepared him for the ache of disappointing someone who mattered. That night, neither of them slept. Avery buried herself in work the next day, hands moving faster than her thoughts, body aching with effort. It was the only way she knew how to survive heartbreak, keep moving, keep fixing things, even if what needed fixing most wasn't mechanical. But a strange ripple moved through town that week. People began talking. Customers returned to the garage. Old suppliers who had stopped working with her after being poached by a competitor suddenly reached out. And whispers floated through town about another garage, one that had been exposed for fraud, intimidation, and tax evasion. Shut down overnight, legal action pending. She didn't connect the dots right away, not until she heard two men talking outside the diner, voices hushed but awed. Some big shot got involved, they say. Quietly took the whole operation down. Nobody knows who. But whoever it was, they did it for the Collins girl. She froze, it couldn't be. Or maybe it could, and that's when she knew. Despite the betrayal, despite the lie, he hadn't walked away. Not really. He'd been watching from the shadows, fixing things the only way he knew how. But it wasn't about the business anymore. It was about her. The next morning, she packed a small bag, got into a truck and drove out of town without telling anyone. She wasn't ready to forgive him. Not yet. But she needed to look him in the eye and ask the question that haunted her more than the betrayal. Why? And whether somehow they still had something worth saving. The city skyline stretched high and glittering before her as Avery drove into the unfamiliar territory of glass towers and concrete veins. The traffic was relentless, pulsing like a living organism. Each car weaving in and out like blood through arteries. Her truck, coated in dust and framed in simplicity, looked like a relic in this place of polished metal and engineered luxury. She felt its every rattle as a heartbeat in her chest, an echo of her own nerves. Brookhaven had faded behind her, but it clung to her like a second skin, the scent of oil and pine, the sound of gravel beneath her boots, the comfort of her own quiet world. Now she was in his world, Ethan Cole's world, and for the first time she felt what he must have felt standing in her garage, out of place, exposed and uncertain of the rules. She had found the address easily. It wasn't hard when the man you were looking for lived in headlines. The building rose 35 stories into the sky, guarded by marble and chrome and a security desk that looked more like a command center than a welcome area. Still, she walked through the revolving doors with her head high, chin steady, and eyes forward. She wasn't here to be impressed. She was here for truth. The receptionist gave her a wary glance, clearly unsure what to make of the woman in scuffed boots and a denim jacket. Avery simply said, "Tell Ethan Cole that Avery Collins is here to see him." Something in her voice silenced further questions. Moments later, an elevator opened at the far end of the lobby. And there he was. He hadn't changed. Or maybe he had. He looked tired, more so than she remembered. There were faint shadows beneath his eyes, and the confidence he usually wore, like armor, was slightly cracked. But his eyes lit up when they landed on her, hope flashing briefly across his face. "You came," he said, stepping forward. "We need to talk," Avery replied. He nodded, stepping aside to gesture toward the elevator. They rode in silence. The hum of the machinery was the only sound between them, and yet 1,000 words hung in the air, unspoken but pressing. Inside his office, she took a moment to look around. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the city. Everything gleamed. Polished surfaces, minimalist furniture, a perfectly ordered desk. It felt cold, controlled. A far cry from the chaos of the garage, the warmth of aged tools and hand-drawn diagrams. He waited, giving her space. Finally, she turned to face him. "It was you, wasn't it? The investigation, the shutdown, the reason. My competitors are suddenly disappearing like smoke. That was you." Ethan didn't deny it. "Yes, I couldn't stand by and do nothing. I found out what they were doing to you. Your business, your reputation. I had to stop it." Her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "And you did all that without telling me." Again, his voice dropped lower, steadier. "Because I didn't want to manipulate you. I didn't want you to feel like you owed me anything." Avery walked to the window, staring out at the city below. "You could have picked up the phone, told me the truth, given me the chance to decide how I felt. I didn't want to risk making it worse." "You already did," she said, her voice softer now, "when you lied the first time." Ethan stepped closer, leaving a careful space between them. "I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need you to know I didn't do this for some kind of redemption arc. I did it because what was happening to you wasn't right, and because I care. Not about your garage, about you." She turned then, meeting his eyes. "You keep saying that, but you still kept me in the dark. You still made decisions without me." "I'm trying to learn," he said, the words cracking slightly. "I've spent so much of my life being in control of everything. Every risk, every angle, every move calculated. But you're the first thing I haven't been able to control. And it terrifies me." The vulnerability in his voice caught her off guard. He wasn't deflecting. Not this time. There was no polished version of the truth. No spin. Avery's shoulders dropped slightly, tension easing just enough to let honesty in. "I'm not asking you to be perfect," she said quietly. "I'm asking you to be real. With me. Even when it's messy. Even when it hurts." Ethan nodded, a slow exhale escaping him. "I can do that. I want to do that." There was a long pause, the kind that didn't feel empty but full, of questions, of possibilities, of something starting to shift. Avery took a step toward the door, her hand brushing the edge of the frame. "This doesn't fix everything. You still have to earn back my trust, I know, and I'm not someone you can just save and walk away from." "I don't want to walk away," he said. "I want to walk with you." Her lips lifted slightly, just a flicker. "We'll see." In the days that followed, something new began to grow. Not a return to what they were, but the beginning of what they might be. Ethan cleared his schedule, canceling a trip to New York and rescheduling meetings. He spent more time in Brookhaven, but not as a billionaire slumming it in a small town. He showed up to help, not to lead, not to control, but to listen, to learn. Together, they hosted a workshop at the garage for local high school students interested in mechanics. Avery led the sessions. Ethan stood back and watched, wide-eyed, as she spoke with passion and precision, her hands flying across engines like a composer at a piano. The students adored her, and he couldn't take his eyes off her. Later that week, she found him in the back of the garage organizing parts. He looked up, smudged with grease, clearly out of his depths but trying anyway. "You're getting better at this," she teased. "I'm terrible at this," he admitted, "but I'm good at showing up." She smiled, that rare, quiet kind of smile that told him maybe, just maybe, he was starting to find his place beside her. One evening, as they sat on the hood of her dad's old truck beneath a sky streaked with orange and lavender, Avery looked over at him. "Do you think we can really make this work?" she asked. Ethan didn't hesitate. "I think we already are." She looked down at her hands, then at the fields beyond the garage, the place where so much had started and fallen apart and begun again. "Don't hurt me again," she said. "I won't," he replied, and this time she believed him. They sat, in silence, shoulder to shoulder, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to blink into place, each one a quiet promise that even the darkest nights always led to something bright. By early autumn, Brookhaven had begun to change. The breeze carried a chill now, brushing through the trees with the quiet confidence of a new season. Leaves turned rust-colored at the edges and the light fell softer across the streets. But it wasn't just nature in transition. There was something different in the people too, an undercurrent of energy, the kind that comes when small things start growing into something larger. At the heart of that change, almost without intending it, stood the garage. Avery's garage. Her father's legacy, once on the brink of collapse, now thrived again, not because of a windfall or a miracle, but because of belief. Her belief. Ethan's too. Ethan had stayed. Not as a visitor or a man playing a temporary role, but as someone who began to shed his polished skin, one piece at a time. He learned the names of regulars. He sat on tool crates and handed Avery wrenches, still unable to remember which was which, but always there. He traded in his suits for denim shirts and occasionally wore boots that didn't match the rest of his life. He helped launch a program for youth interested in trades and business, investing not just money, but time, mentorship, structure, vision. But he never overshadowed her. He made sure everything they did together. Avery, for her part, had softened, but not in the way people assume when a woman falls in love. She hadn't changed to fit someone else's world. If anything, she had grown firmer in her values, more certain of her voice. She didn't need Ethan to rescue her, and he no longer tried to. What they were building was something far more difficult and far more rare. A relationship grounded in mutual respect, hard-won trust, and a willingness to be wrong sometimes and still choose to stay. But even stability has its tests. Ethan received an invitation one morning, folded neatly in an envelope embossed with the seal of a global innovation council. It was an opportunity that would place him on the world stage, guiding ethical technology reform across multiple countries. A year-long commitment, based in London, with travel, prestige, and influence, beyond anything he'd ever had before. He stared at it for a long time, sitting at the breakfast counter in the small kitchen of the cottage he'd started renting just outside town. He didn't open it immediately, didn't even touch his coffee. When Avery walked in, still wearing her grease-smeared coveralls, hair pulled back in a bun, she saw the expression on his face and instantly knew. Without a word, she picked up the envelope and turned it over in her hands. "You're not sure if you want to go," she said, not as a question but a quiet observation. "I don't know what it means if I say yes," he replied. "It means your life is still big," she said, "and you're still allowed to want big things." He looked up at her. "But do I have to lose this to have that?" She sat across from him. There was no defensiveness in her posture, no wounded pride, only calm, considered presence. "Not if we choose something better," she said. "Not if we make this a partnership that includes hard choices. You don't belong to a boardroom anymore, Ethan. And I don't belong to just this garage. We can build something new if we want it enough." And so they did. Ethan turned down the position, not because he was giving up ambition, but because ambition now meant something different. Instead, he proposed a domestic project that allowed him to stay close, launching a network of community-centered business incubators in rural towns across the country. One would begin in Brookhaven, with Avery's garage as the first anchor. The night he made the decision, they sat together on the porch of the house he was renovating slowly, hands wrapped around mugs of cider, stars above them like scattered promises. It was Avery who broke the silence. "My dad used to say you only get one shot at building the kind of life you want. Everything else is just noise." "I think I finally know what that means," Ethan said. "It's not about getting more. It's about choosing better." A few weeks later, the garage hosted its first ever autumn open house. Locals came with pies and folding chairs. Kids got to paint car parts and eat too many cookies. Someone strung up lights across the lot, and the band from the high school played blues covers with surprising talent. As the sun dipped below the far trees, casting everything in warm gold, Ethan stood beside Avery, hands stuffed in his pockets, heart racing for reasons that had nothing to do with business. He turned to her and said quietly, "Can I steal you for a second?" She raised an eyebrow, half smiling. "We're literally standing next to each other." "Still," he said, "come with me." They stepped away from the crowd, around the side of the building, beneath the arch of string lights that had been strung between the trees. There, Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. Avery's breath caught in her throat. "I've thought about this 1,000 different ways," he began. "None of them felt right until now, because this isn't about asking you to change your life or fit into mine. This is about the life we've already started building. Every bolt, every late night, every mistake, and every quiet moment in between. You've taught me that love isn't the finish line. It's a foundation, one you pour and protect and rebuild again and again. And if you let me, I want to keep rebuilding it with you." He opened the box. The ring was simple, elegant, but not extravagant. It didn't try to prove anything. It just was. Avery stared at it, then at him. "I never imagined myself being proposed to behind a garage," she said. He smiled. "You said once you didn't want perfect, just real." She didn't answer with words. She reached out, took his hand and said, "Okay, let's build it." Months passed, the seasons turned. The garage stayed busy, but the pace was no longer frantic. It was balanced, purposeful. Ethan split his time between projects across the country and quiet dinners at home. Avery expanded the shop's services, training young women in trade skills and mentoring kids who reminded her of herself, scrappy, stubborn, unsure of their worth. Their wedding was small, held in the field behind the garage, surrounded by the people who had watched them fall apart and come back together. There were no flower walls or curated table settings, just picnic benches, mismatched dishes, and laughter that echoed through the trees. Avery wore her father's old watch wrapped around her bouquet. Ethan wore cufflinks engraved with the words, "Start here." They said their vows with dirty hands and full hearts. After the ceremony, as they stood by the open hood of a 1969 Mustang they'd rebuilt together, Avery turned to him and said, "You know, I used to think my life would be small." He looked at her, touched her cheek. "It's never been small. You just hadn't met someone who saw how big it already was." They kissed. And somewhere between the smell of gasoline and wildflowers, between the weight of their past and the promise of what lay ahead, they stepped into the life they'd chosen, not because it was easy or perfect, but because it was theirs and it was enough. Ethan Cole was a man who had everything, success, wealth, and recognition, but felt profoundly disconnected from himself. Avery Collins, a small-town mechanic with grit and grace, lived a life built on integrity, resilience, and quiet strength. Their worlds collided on a dusty back road where a flat tire sparked something far greater than a conversation. It began a journey of truth, vulnerability, and transformation. From lies uncovered to trust slowly rebuilt, their story wasn't about grand gestures or fairy tale endings. It was about choosing each other, again and again, through mistakes, growth, and the slow work of love. Together, they didn't just fall in love. They built it, bolt by bolt, choice by choice, across two vastly different lives now woven into one. The greatest lesson from Ethan and Avery's story is this: real connection begins where ego ends. When we strip away the labels, CEO, mechanic, wealthy, poor, we meet one another with honesty and humility. In today's world of surface-level interactions, choosing to lead with truth and heart is revolutionary. Whether in love, friendship, or ambition, authenticity is the foundation that endures. If this story touched you, inspired you, or reminded you what really matters, subscribe to our channel to support more meaningful content. Your support helps us keep creating stories that stir the soul. Stay with us. There's more to come.